Welcome to the Heart Lab podcast presented by the St. Vincent's Institute and Victor Chang Cardiac Research Institute. My name is Alex Clements. I'm here with Professor André La Gerche, head of the Heart Lab, a newly found venture. André, welcome, first of all.
Thanks, Alex. Good to be here.
And the Heart Lab, give us a quick 101 on what it is, how you set it up.
So the Heart Lab, we're a team of about 10 people. We've got some PhD students, some postdoctoral, meaning they've done a PhD, and some research assistants. And at the moment we have a couple of people from Belgium and one from Spain, sort of as international guests. But the whole thrust of the Heart Lab is that we're using the study of exercise and its effect on the heart to understand heart disease. So we sort of study elite athletes, but a lot of what we learn gets applied to people with really quite sick hearts, heart rhythm problems, even looking at why people die suddenly. But a lot of that's done through the frame of understanding the sort of F1 engines of the human world, the athletes.
Today we're going to talk about this idea of how many heartbeats you have to use.
Yes.
You sent me this research report and it's got in there, it starts off with a quote from Donald Trump out of his book saying the human body is like a battery with a finite amount of energy, which exercise only depletes.
Yes.
Which infers that why would you use your heartbeats up?
Yeah. It's
when you've only got so many.
It's restating that phrase, you've only got so many heartbeats, why waste them? Why waste them on exercise? And like so many things of Donald Trump, it sort of sounds, it's simplistic and sounds somewhat plausible, but it's just about 100% wrong. Because at least he's right in that you only have so much energy in your battery, you only have so many heartbeats, but he's completely wrong in terms of exercise using them up, because it's quite the opposite.
Let's start with, you've only got so many. So do you only actually have so many?
Well, it's really interesting because if we look across the entire animal species, there's a really consistent number of heartbeats before you die. So if it's a roundabout, and I don't even know what this number is, but 10 to the power of 10. So that's like trillion something. It's a big number. And if you're a mouse, you go grrrr at 300, 400 beats per minute, and it lasts a year or two and then you die. If you're a whale, your heartbeat is 8 beats per minute and you last many, many, many years and then you die. But the actual amount of heartbeats across across most studied species is incredibly consistent. And so that's the concept that there's some set metabolic battery, there's some set amount of energy that everyone's given that can then be used up. Interestingly, humans step outside of, so that relationship between heartbeats and how long you have to live, you can draw a line from the mouse, through to the whale. And humans step outside it a little bit, which is believed to be because of sort of health advances and things. We live longer than would be expected for the amount of heartbeats. But even within humans, if we look at just the human species, the slower your heart rate, the longer you live. So it seems that both within humans and across the entire animal species, you have a set amount of heartbeats and you want to use as few as you can.
So in the last 4 minutes of recording this show, we've used up some of our heartbeats.
We have. We're not going to get this 4 minutes back.
Right, gotcha. Let's talk about the energy piece. So the using, obviously when you exercise, your heart rate increases. A lot of the time when you're doing a kind of full exertion of exercise, you're getting to that maximal heart rate, you're using upward of 150, 160, 170 beats per minute.
So we can think of energy and heartbeats kind of as the same thing because there's a very linear relationship between how much work you do and how many heartbeats. So, you rev harder, the harder you have to work. So whether you want to think about heartbeats or sort of energy, it's the same thing. And when you exercise, you use more energy, you use more heartbeats. And so it would seem, simplistically, that you're using up some of your given heartbeats. The other side of it, though, is that the fitter you get, the more metabolically efficient you become, And so when you're sitting there at rest, an athlete's heartbeat will be 40 beats per minute rather than 70 or 80. And if you're exercising 1 hour a day, that's about 5% of your time. So if you use up 1 hour's worth of heartbeats at a high rate, and for the other 23 hours you're half someone else's heart rate, then it stands to reason you're actually saving heartbeats.
Do you just talk through, I guess, like this piece of research they did, the graph that they put out, and you'll do your best work to articulate this graph via a podcast.
Yeah. So this is work we did just to prove that concept. It's a simple concept. There was some also rationale because when we have people with pacemakers, we want to understand what the normal use of heartbeats are so that we can program pacemakers. But it also really speaks to this. So we put Holter monitors, which are rhythm monitors, and they record every single heartbeat. We put Holter monitors on athletes and told them to train and do everything as per normal. We got 110 of those. And then we took 40 non-athletes, quite, average fitness people, but not athletes. And we got them to wear their Holter monitor and said, do everything you normally do. So we had athlete versus, two groups of people doing what they do. And the athletes used about 10,000 beats and the non-athletes used 12,000 beats. The athletes did more exercise and they spent more time at the really high bits of heart rate, just as we described before. But the compensatory slow heart rate, we call that bradycardia, that was much more of the time and much more profound. So if we could show you, with the graph, the whole thing is shifted to the left. If you can imagine heart rate starting at 30 and going up to 180, the athletes were really shifted so that they spend a lot more time with their heart rate in the 30s, 40s, 50s. Still a little tail right up at 180 beats per minute. But again, if you're even elite athletes, they actually spend relatively small amount of time up at that tail and a lot of time. So basically they save 2,000 beats a day by being athletic. So if you've only got so many heartbeats, if you've only got so much battery, being an athlete and using the high end saves you beats.
And you get 2,000 a day. That's a pretty good return.
Yes. I can't do the maths as to what 2,000 gives you out of 10 to the power of 10. Every day it would count to very, very little. But the whole concept of, and heart rate again does come back to energy. So the sort of the science or the thought behind why animals with a lower heart rate live longer is this concept of it being tied to metabolism and efficiency. And so a small rodent is quite a metabolically active it needs to use a lot of energy just to get by, has to eat a lot relative to its body weight, etc., etc. Humans use less energy and whales, etc., for their body mass. It's a relatively efficient machine that we have. And when you're an athlete, you become even more efficient again. So when you're sitting there, the elite athlete is sitting there semi-hibernating. They're just not needing to use much energy. And so the heart's going, oh, really? Do I need to beat? And so it's going really quite slowly. It's an extremely efficient machine. As you become less well, as you become less fit, as you become sick at the extreme, your body needs to use more and more energy to do less and less, and you have a higher heart rate. If you're sick with something in the hospital, your heart rate might be 100, 110, 120. You're using up a lot of heartbeats because you need that energy. So, basically doing exercise, being fit, makes you a more efficient engine that can last longer. So if this was one of those, shows a mythbuster, you'd say at this point, Donald Trump, your myth has been busted.
In terms of the definition of an athlete, what do people need to be doing to put themselves into that category?
It's a very good question. There's been a lot of struggling amongst sort of the sports cardiology fraternity to define what an athlete is. I think broadly, often the definition we use is someone doing more than 3 hours of exercise that is aimed at making them fitter, so that it is aimed at improving their performance and where they're involved in sort of regular competition. But it's funny because we often think of an athlete as some sort of category, a binary category, when in fact, of course, fitness, training, everything is a spectrum. And even athletes can be less fit or more fit depending on what time of their career or whatever. And it's actually interesting because the heartbeat story has another part of it, which is, can you do too much training? Can you start to use up heartbeats? And one of the things that we did in the same analysis was to look at the data that we could get off the web from people who did the Tour de France, the men and the male and female version. And we had about 40 of each where they published their heart rate data whilst doing the race. And we had to fill in a bit of a gap because we didn't know their heart rate when they weren't racing. But we could do that from our own data reasonably accurately. And if you're doing the Tour de France, you actually are going so hard for 4-6 hours, etc., and then the recovery where your heart rate's still up, that you actually then do start using more heartbeats than a non-athlete. So there's this whole concept that maybe you can do too much exercise, and that's quite some debate. What I would say is that if you were to do the Tour de France every day for a year, you would be in real strife. Yeah. Like it's just sort of stands to logic, but even from the heart rate data. And I think it'd be really interesting, and this is a shout out to people at Apple or Garmin or wherever you sit in San Francisco, that in the big data, when you get millions of data points, I think there probably is a sweet spot where this amount of heartbeats you use can be quite a useful metric, because if you're fit, you use less heartbeats. If you're overdoing it, you start to use too many heartbeats. And so there's this kind of sweet spot. And most people, the vast majority of athletes, would be on the very healthy part of that metric. I mean, there aren't many athletes who could even dream of doing the Tour de France for longer than 3 weeks, let alone, and we see that, the people who have attempted the Giro d'Italia and then the Tour de France double or the triple, it's a really, really tough thing to do. And I would say that the Tour de France is kind of a model of overtraining. Everyone comes out the other end pretty burnt. And even simple metrics like how many heartbeats you use could give us a little insight into that.
So could you say that if you did the Tour of Italy, the Giro, and then backed up and did the Tour de France, so you're doing 60 or 42 days of stage racing within 3 to 4 months, it's actually, they're less healthy than someone that's doing an hour of exercise in the morning?
I think, yes, possibly. So I think that what even history tells us, because so few people have been able to do that double and do it well, that it's beyond the optimum fitness. And then there's individual variability and some people that can manage load better than others. But I think for people listening to the podcast, one thing I often say is that the biggest health bang for the buck is in going from unfit to average fitness. There's a massive benefit, which would also be seen in this heart rate data, interestingly, because you actually don't have to be a super athlete to get your heart rate down. Whereas everything beyond average fitness, there's further gains in health outcomes, but they become less and less. We call it the asymptote of benefit, meaning that as you get fitter, the gains become less. And don't for a minute think I'm saying, there's no benefit in doing what you want to do, because there's a lot of fun, there's a lot of cycle. I love exercise, but beyond a good level of fitness, the rest is for the love of it, essentially. And then if you really overdo it, I think that things like the Tour de France, which is not designed as a healthful, it is healthy, but no one's saying go out and do 6 hours as hard as you can every day. That, and I think if people did, then we would start to see the some of the consequences that we do see with overuse even of the heart in these really highly trained athletes.
What do you start to see?
So there's things that are proven and things that are suspected. Things that are proven are things like a heart rhythm problem called atrial fibrillation, which is about 5 times more common in endurance athletes. It's not life-threatening, but it's one royal pain in the bum. Like it causes people's heart rate to be erratic and fast. It increases the risk of stroke, of heart function sort of wearing out. So you don't want atrial fibrillation. It is something that we can treat pretty effectively as well, but it is a little sting in the tail. I think it's completely outweighed by the benefits. You know, athletes live healthier for longer, but it's a bit like, you know, it's a bit like the professional tennis player. You're a very healthy, very flexible, very strong, blah, 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 but you might get tennis elbow, you know, and in some ways I'd sort of see atrial fibrillation as a little bit the tennis elbow of the heart of the professional cyclist.
Do you know why it causes that?
There's a lot of theories. Exercise, because it's interesting again with the heart rate, the slower the heart rate gets, that is also accompanied by the heart getting bigger. And that's a healthy thing. The main thing that an athlete needs to pump more blood, more petrol, and it does that by being bigger. It just pumps more with every beat. But it seems to some degree that enlargement of the heart muscle and the stretching of the heart muscle with exercise might be one of the factors. Then there's a bit of a theory that exercise causes some short-term inflammation. And maybe sometimes that lays down a little bit of sort of scar tissue, a little bit like if you're a lifetime runner and someone comes and cuts up your calf and your Achilles, you'll find lots of little bits of scar. And we think that occurs to some extent in the heart of highly trained athletes. So that combination, then there's a number of other sort of nerve inputs and various things, but no one completely understands. There's also, interestingly, some of the work we've done that there's also a genetic predisposition. So we can work out to some extent by looking at what's called a polygenic risk score. We can see who's more likely to get atrial fibrillation. The only thing is that genetic risk is exactly the same in athletes as non-athletes. So it is one of the factors. Athletes within the broad church of athletes, there's some that are genetically less and more likely to get it. But that doesn't explain the difference because that genetic risk is the same in athletes and non-athletes. So it's genes plus something, and the plus something is exercise, and exactly why exercise causes the atrial fibrillation we haven't put our finger on precisely.
Other causes of training too hard?
Yeah,
training too much? Replicating the Tour de France in your day-to-day life somehow?
Yeah, so there's the big ticket items are whether really extreme exercise causes heart muscle damage that could cause heart rhythm problems that are life-threatening. So these rhythms like ventricular tachycardia and ventricular fibrillation, which are the more serious things, and they can cause the heart to go really, really fast, pass out, and worst case scenarios, people can die. It's not clear whether, and those things are rare. So whereas atrial fibrillation, for example, occurs in about 10% of 80-year-olds, ventricular tachycardia and ventricular fibrillation are less than 1 in 5,000, type 1 in 10,000. They're uncommon. But there's a little bit of suspicion that also might be more common in athletes. That's one of the things we're working on. It's just very difficult because you can imagine if it is 1 in 5,000 type thing, then you need tens or hundreds of thousands of athletes versus non-athletes to work out whether it's more common. But there's a bit of a hint, and people will know of some of the sort of more famous cases in pro cycling, etc., where people have had a cardiac arrest or have died suddenly, triathletes, people with defibrillators, and it does seem that there's a bit that there are more than we would expect for a young, healthy group. So, our research group is looking into, and I would say that our research points towards the heart being a little bit irritable, has a little bit of a tendency to have heart rhythm problems than a non-athletic heart. But it's only a little bit, and it's not enough to say for me to recommend to people not to exercise. What we see as the challenge, the throwaway line in our lab, is we want to make exercise safe for everyone, because it's one of the most healthy, it is so strongly associated with healthful outcomes, good psychology, and good length of life. It is our best medicine. But we want to try to work out who it is and why it is that some people get this little, what I'd call sting in the tail.
In terms of maximal heart rate, obviously changes over time. What do we know? What do you need to know? Is it important?
Yeah, so maximum, it's interesting. So we talk about this thing called heart rate reserve, which is the amount of heartbeats between your resting heart rate and your maximum heart rate. And that's one of the two strongest determinants of fitness, or VO2 max, are how big your heart is and how much heart rate reserve you have. Your heart rate reserve, the distance between resting and peak heart rate, is more determined by your resting heart rate, which comes back to this concept again that the less heartbeats you use, but the slower your heart rate, in general, the fitter you are because of that heart rate reserve. To some extent, however, the peak heart rate is also important. And one of the really interesting, so as we get older, we lose about 1 heartbeat per year of maximum heart rate. And hence the equation when people say, what should your heart rate be, your maximum heart rate? There's this 220 minus your age sort of concept. So the average 20-year-old, their maximum heart rate would be 200. By the time you get to 70, it's 150 on average. Now, there's people that are faster and people that are slower. But it's quite an interesting thing. One of the really interesting things is that you would expect, given that the more revs you have, kind of the more flow you can generate. But in endurance athletes, the peak heart rate on average is actually slightly lower. So we think there's a bit of a trade-off between the heart getting the benefits of having a bigger engine, but the problem with a bigger engine is the faster it goes, the harder it is to fill. And it finds that right balance by having slightly less revs with more to fill. And probably because the endurance heart is actually not built or not. The training means that your output at absolutely maximum is not as important as it is at about 80%. Like when you're in the Tour de France, the cyclists would actually quite rarely get to their true max heart rate, but they spend an enormous amount of time around what we call ventilatory threshold, that sort of high level of exercise that they can sustain for a long period of time. And the heart is more efficient if it's doing that type of exercise with more volumes and less revs. So the heart trades off a few revs for being able to pump a bit more with every beat. It's more efficient.
Versus if you looked at a track sprinter.
Yeah, so exactly. If we look at a 200, 400 metre runner, they don't lose their peak heart rate because their training needs them to be absolutely have every rev they can get. And they tend to have smaller hearts as well.
Any other interesting facts you want to touch on from this study?
Not really. I like coming back to sort of where we started, which is just what a pleasure it is to prove Trump wrong. Hope we don't lose too many podcast listeners with that.
On heart rate, is it like, what would you love to know? What's something that you would love to be able to find out, to research, to touch on, to understand, and that would have the most impact?
So I think I would look at sort of two ends of the spectrum for that question, because on the micro side, what we have sometimes is when people have what we call chronotropic incompetence, which means that they lose the ability to set their heart rate. And we put pacemakers in them and try to replicate what their heart rate should be. And we have various inputs, and the pacemakers do it very badly. So it would be really nice to understand some of the inputs so that we could help those people out. But that's at the micro level, because it's really only very few people. On the macro level, coming back to that sort of Silicon Valley concept, I really think that there is a health metric around getting your average heart rate, or the number of beats that you use every day, down to as low as possible. And paradoxically, that will involve more training. But when you train too much, it'll start going the other way. And I think on what we call big data or population level, we will be able to find that sweet spot for the population and for individuals And I think it'll become a metric on your watch. You've used this many heartbeats, and it's getting less. It's heading in the right direction. Hey, you're doing too much training. You're not doing enough sleeping. You're getting stressed. It's going the other way. And it's a really, how many heartbeats you use, how much simpler a metric could you use? And I think it's going to end up being a good summary of health.
And like the way that exercise drives that kind of usage down, I assume lack of sleep, too many beers at the pub on a Friday, all those kind of things drive it back the other way.
Absolutely. It's amazing for a simple metric how if you, people are picking up on this now. They wear their watch and they have 3-4 beers and they find out in the morning that their average heart rate was 3 beats higher than it would if they didn't have the beers. They've used up heartbeats. Similarly, the time when your heart rate's lowest is when you're sleeping. If you don't get enough sleep, you're using up too many heartbeats. So it's kind of an amazing sort of metric of metabolism, of stress, of the right amount of exercise. It's ridiculously simple. People would laugh at the concept, but it's also incredibly complex because you use up heartbeats here to save heartbeats there and all of this sort of concept. But it really does reinforce the more time you spend either really using your metabolism, like exercise, and the rest of the time really relaxing and saving battery is a really good thing. And sleep and quality of sleep and all of these things come into it.
Thanks, Andre. We'll publish this. We'll have the visuals on the YouTube, and we'll also put the link to the research paper on the website.
Perfect. Thanks, Alex.